Have you ever seen a bird opening a puzzle box before? Once a bird figures out how to solve a puzzle, how do different techniques spread into the rest of the population? In this episode, biologist Dr. Michael Chimento joins us to discuss his research on attention in great tits as they socially learn how to solve puzzles. Hi there, and welcome to In the Swarm, where we dive into the minds behind the hive. I'm your host, Dr. Nexter Smith, and today I'm happy to bring in a very special guest, our in-house bird specialist, Dr. Michael Chimento. Hi, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks for joining us. It's so good to have you here.
My pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a postdoc here at the Center for the Advanced Study of Collective Behavior, and I also have affiliation with the Max Planck for Animal Behavior as well as Uni Zurich. And these days I study social learning and animal culture in birds, but in a previous life I studied evolutionary linguistics, and in a previous life I studied international relations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long journey, but it's super interesting. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your birds? So you look specifically into great tits, right? And their culture.
Yeah, that's correct. So great tits are a small songbird that are all over Europe, similar to a chickadee for American listeners. And they're really special because they can socially learn from each other. So they can watch each other performing new behaviors, and they can learn these behaviors. So my work is all about how this happens, and more specifically, how changes to their social network can influence this process.
So in neuroscience, we have a lot of animal models that we look at, and one of those are corvids, so like ravens and crows, right? And I thought that those do culture learning. So why great tits and why not like the other more well-known bird models?
Part of it is practicality. So corvids are notoriously difficult to handle in captivity, and it takes a long time for them to get used to human presence. Whereas the great tits, you can catch them quite readily in the forest. You just kind of set up a net and a feeder, and they'll go into the net. But the great tits, I mean, they're small birds, but they're surprisingly clever, and they have a long history. I think a lot of people might be familiar with the milk bottle cap opening spread of innovation.
Right.
Yeah,
they were great tits.
Yeah, so blue tits and great tits would do that. So that was the start of the interest in great tits, and that was in the 30s, 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And they've just become kind of a staple model species in behavioral ecology, mainly because they're readily available. Essentially, if you go into any woodlands in Europe or in the UK, you can find great tits, and you just put up some nest boxes, and then you have a study population.
Yeah, so, that's super cool. In fact, I don't think you even need to go into the woods. You can just sit in your garden. So, do you think you could tell us a bit more about what really is culture? Is bird culture very different from human culture? Why do we want to look into how the great tits, interact and how they learn? Like, why? What's a big deal about them?
Yeah, usually when people think about the word culture, they think of going to the opera or
right.
a musical or something like that. And that, of course, is culture. But biologists take a much wider definition of what culture is. So I would define culture as any piece of information that's replicated through social learning. Mm-hmm. So any behavior, or in humans, religion, ideology, things like this could all be considered culture. And when you have this really wide definition, then you can start to look for analogies to culture in animal species. So things like foraging techniques, which is what I focus on in the tits. But also there's decades of work showing that birdsong is culturally inherited. So it's passed from usually father to son if the males are singing. And yeah, so these behaviors, you can think about these behaviors as distributions that change over time. There's some variants that become more popular and some variants that become less popular. So just like there are kind of fads in human culture, there can be trends in animal culture as well.
Right. So do you think that social learning has to strictly be something between generations, or can we observe, changes happening dynamically within one generation?
Yeah, so I would say that, of course, social learning can happen between any two individuals. It depends on the species, like what behaviors are socially learned when. But culture, in order to be considered culture, I would say it should persist over several generations. But the actual transfer of information doesn't have to be, we would call it vertical if it's from parent to child. It can also be horizontal from peers.
There's this concept about how culture spreads through social network. Do you think you can tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So culture can spread through a social network through a few different ways. So I think in humans, usually we communicate with language, ideas, or explain how to do behaviors. So we have this kind of direct line of connection. But in animal species, they don't have this. So it's based on observation. And you could have something as, if you perform a behavior, then I'll watch the behavior and try to directly copy it, which would be something like imitation. You could have emulation, which is when you perform a behavior and I see the reward that you get, and I try to emulate the reward without directly copying. And then the third option is like something like enhancement, where if you interact with an object, then I'm more likely to interact with that object. And through all of these different mechanisms, behaviors can spread from individual to individual.
Are there any kind of mechanisms that are more popular? Is imitation something that you see more? For example, like, not to make it too broad, like in great tits, for example?
Yeah, so there's people have tried to classify these and come up with kind of a hierarchy. I would say imitation is closer to the top of the hierarchy. It's more maybe cognitively demanding, and there are lots of hypotheses about how people do this or how animals do this, something like mirror neurons, for example. I would say that for the tits, I would conservatively say probably it's not direct imitation. I think it would be something closer to enhancement. But it really depends on the behavior, and it also depends on the species. Because also great tits are vocal learners, in which case it is actually imitation.
So Michael just mentioned he thinks the great tits is doing a local enhancement rather than direct imitation. But what does this actually mean?
Yeah, so both of these terms are linked to the concept of learning in general. And actually, learning is trying to understand the link between two concepts or two events. When you do social learning, you actually delegate this work to someone else. So someone else is investing time to find this relationship. Then afterwards, you as an observer, you will copy what you can observe. So either it's local enhancement, so then your attention would be focused on something specific, like a place, or it's imitation, then you copy the whole behavioral act of the demonstrator. So let's take an example and think about a researcher who wants to see how an opening technique spreads in the population of monkeys, for example. So he will set up a box that has two opening techniques. Either you push the door or you slide the door to get to the reward. So this researcher will teach an individual in the population to push the door and to get the reward. This individual will be seen as the demonstrator. So if you, for example, go back to the field, you put the box behind a curtain. And then the demonstrator comes and it goes to the box. It's basically pushing the door. The other individuals don't see it. And then it's going away with the reward. And in the population of monkeys, you will have observers that will see that. And they will be like, hold on, but behind this curtain, there must be something weird that is giving a reward. So an observer goes behind the curtain and is seeing this box. And he's like, oh, how can I solve that? And basically, let's say 50% of them will push and the other will slide the door and get the reward.
I see. So in this case, kind of the population is more attracted to kind of the location of there's a reward there, and they go behind the curtain, and as a result, it's just like half of it push and half of it slide.
Exactly. That's local enhancement. And now if you want to have a proof of imitation, then you should remove the curtain. And then in this case, the observer, they could see the overall behavioral act of the demonstrator. So they could see that the demonstrator comes close to the box, is pushing the door, getting a reward, and going away from the box. And now if imitation occurs, an observer comes close to the box, is like, oh, I just need to push the door, I get the reward, I go away, and I'm happy.
Oh, so in this case, the population actually kind of learns or imitates this demonstrator of actually the actual skill to do it. And in this case, the whole population will basically push, right?
Exactly, that's exactly that.
I see. Let's get back to Nak and Michael.
Let's get right into the birds, shall we? How do you really study culture in great tits?
Sure. So we use puzzle boxes to study culture. So our puzzle box has a little sliding door that the birds can move either left or right. And when they move the door far enough, it reveals a little hole that has mealworms inside of it. And great tits love mealworms. So this is a great reward for them. And I should say that the puzzle boxes are automated, so they're controlled by Raspberry Pi, which is a microcomputer. So that can record the identity of the great tit when it came, what it did at the puzzle box. And from this kind of data, we can take a look at how behaviors spread through a population. During my PhD, the first experiment that I did was all about how changes to the social network can impact culture, because there's these ideas that if you introduce new individuals into a population, maybe they're more innovative, maybe they can come up with a better solution. And so for this experiment, I designed a puzzle box where the hole behind the door was offset just a little bit. So pushing from one side was better than pushing from the other side. And the idea was to, if you have a population that has figured out how to solve it in the less efficient way, how would the population change to a more efficient way if the population was either stable, where individuals stayed the same over time, or if there was population turnover, where individuals were replaced with new individuals. So to do this, we created these micropopulations of captive great tits. So we would catch them from the wild, bring them into aviaries that we have in Möggingen, and we would teach one of the birds in each of the populations to solve the puzzle. And this is how we seed the behavior into those populations.
So the old population, you teach them the non-efficient way, and the new population, you teach them, like the...
No, not like that. So we teach one bird in the population how to solve the puzzle in the non-efficient way.
Right.
Then from that tutor, you could call it, the behavior will spread through the population. And previous work showed that they copy each other. So they're conformist learners. So they'll learn that inefficient solution. And then once it's spread through the population, we start replacing the individuals. So the individuals that are coming into the population know nothing about the puzzle box. And we were just curious what would happen.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
Would they keep on learning the inefficient behavior, or would they innovate? Maybe. Yeah, we weren't sure.
Okay, so at no point did you teach them how to do it like the perfect way?
No, we didn't train that. We would only train the inefficient solution.
How cool. All right.
The result of that experiment was that the turnover populations did switch over to the more efficient solution. And then we were trying to figure out why. And you can't ask a bird if you innovated it. So we have to look directly at the data. And what the data seems to tell us is that the older residents, so the birds that were there from the beginning, they would sometimes produce the more efficient behavior, but they wouldn't adopt it. So they would produce it and then go back to the inefficient way.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which was surprising, because they should be able to tell, like, oh, this is much easier if I do it this way. But interestingly, the naive birds that were coming in were picking up that efficient solution and running with it. So they would adopt it, and that would be the majority of their productions would be this better solution. So this led us to this idea that maybe naive individuals are better samplers in some sense. They don't have as much experience with the puzzle box, and they don't have like a heavy weight placed on the inefficient behavior. So it could be something like muscle memory, for example. Maybe it's hard to overcome the muscle memory that they've already developed. We're still not sure. That the experiment couldn't tell us exactly why this was, but yeah, it was this interesting result where introducing new individuals into a population can sometimes be good for the cultural state of the population. And it's really interesting because it's similar to an experiment that was done like way back in the late 80s and early 90s on blue-headed wrasse, which is a species of fish that culturally inherit their spawning sites. And yeah, there's this cool experiment where they live in these coral reefs, and they were basically taking entire populations of these fish and transferring them from population to population. So they were replacing entire populations, and they found that the new fish picked different spawning sites the first time that they replaced the population. So it's this idea of kind of like cultural inertia, where it's like you're just choosing the site because it's what you saw others using, and you don't actually sample the space yourself. Yeah, so this is just a nice kind of analogy to also what was happening with the tits.
It's actually really cool. It makes me think about payoff between, do I need to invest in new solutions as a single individual, as opposed to, well, something's already been established, my entire culture does this. As an individual, I better reserve my energy or my cognitive load for something else. I don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah, this is a classic idea in the social learning literature, that social learning gives you access to cheap information, but It might be outdated information. Mm-hmm. So to be optimal about it, you should have some flexibility where you switch between individual and social learning. I think having a little bit of population mixing is good. And it mirrors what we see in the natural populations of great tits. So in the wintertime, they form these foraging flocks, and the composition of those flocks changes over the course of a day. So they have this natural kind of fission fusion thing that's happening in their natural populations.
In one day?
Sure, yeah, because as the flock moves through the forest, some birds join the flock, some birds leave the flock, etc. So you get this kind of rolling composition. It's a natural part of their ecology that they would have this population change. This is totally different to something like primate social groups, for example,
Right.
which are really stable over years and years and years. So.
Actually, when we chatted outside of this podcast, we were talking about why modeling and how modeling is important for you in order to figure out like a bunch of things related to the great tits behavior. Can you tell the listeners a bit more about that?
Sure. So when you're talking about modeling, you're talking about agent-based modeling. So this is when you simulate populations of animals, whatever you would want to simulate. And this is a method that's widely used in behavioral ecology because it's hard to study large systems. And it's a way that you can kind of explore different hypotheses. And it's a really nice way of doing it because it forces you to mathematically formalize those hypotheses. For me, modeling is a way to explore the hypotheses about the cognition of the birds, or in anything, actually, the cognition of any species you could think of, and how that might change cultural states. And also, it's a way to extend the experiments on the birds because it's a lot of effort to go catch the birds, run the experiment. Whereas with a model, you can simulate 10,000 individuals in 1 minute.
If you want to get started with modeling, but you don't have so much of a hypotheses or theories behind what you expect to see, because I wonder when you try to set up a model, you need to be a bit more precise, right? You need to kind of know what you're looking out for. If you start off with nothing, like how would that work?
Then you shouldn't.
Then you shouldn't.
I would say then you shouldn't. So for me,
Right.
The inspiration for the models that I've done during my PhD was the results of the experiment, which showed that this effect of like sampling and the differences between the birds that were in the population longer and the newer birds between the sampling behavior, because there's plenty of models of sampling and learning from cognitive science. So I thought, okay, what if I take reinforcement learning model and then pair it with a transmission model? How would that change if I change this parameter, that parameter, whatever? And basically what you end up with for somebody who's never done modeling before, you can imagine it kind of like you make a box with a bunch of different knobs on it, and those knobs control all of the parameters. And the box gives that plays music or something, right? So you can sit there and you can tweak the knobs and see how it changes the output. And then you play around with it until you can get a handle on what this parameter does to the system.
Okay, so would you then compare the output with what you see in the wild?
Yep, you can compare it with experimental results. You can see what generates, like, for example, if you have a certain shape of a diffusion curve. So diffusion curve, you look at like how fast a behavior spreads through a population. You can try to see what parameters combination in the model would most closely match that. It depends on what you look at.
So when you say parameters, what does this mean exactly?
So it could be something related to, let's say, the network structure. So how individuals are connected to each other. So you could make different types of networks, and that would be a kind of parameter that you could control.
Like mom and dad, friends.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like, Jin, you have a network and you're connected to 4 individuals, or you could change that number of connection. In terms of learning, could change something like the transmission rate, how easily behaviors spread from individual to individual, or how quickly individuals update their information, or something like that.
So with these parameters, you would tweak them, right? Let's say you have a box you label as a model, and then you have these two things. The first knob on the box would be how many other great tits does this one great tit know and interact with, and the other knob would be how fast or how slow does this great tit learn in whatever sort of way that it learns. And then so you tweak these things, and then you let the model do its magic, and then you look at the output, and then you want to compare that to what you observe in real life.
So when you model, the technical term is a sensitivity analysis. So
Right.
you hold all of the knobs at the same level and you only turn one knob at a time.
Right.
And then that lets you see the effect of this parameter relative to all of these other parameters. So that's what we do. And the nice thing is, you said this one great tit. So the nice thing about models is, of course, you can simulate, tens of thousands of great tits. And then you can actually zoom in and look at what's happened to every single one of those tits. So it's a good way to explore experiments that you couldn't do in your own time.
What about the effects of human interference? We see great tits all over the place here in Konstanz. In my mind, they're kind of urban birds. Is there a big difference in the culture of urban birds as compared to like really wild ones?
So here in Germany, where we live, the birds are half urban, half rural. So they live on the edge of these two habitats, and many times they'll go in between. Like sometimes they'll go feed from a garden feeder, and other times they'll be going through the forest looking for food. And I think in a lot of places in Europe, probably they're similar to that. The biggest influence that humans have on great tits is, the presence of garden feeders. I would say it can be a positive for them over the winter time. Obviously, it helps them survive, and we also feed the great tits, and we do most of our work during the winter. But you get this consequence that there's also easier disease transmission at those feeders. So if you have a feeder at home that you haven't washed in like 10 years,
do it.
Probably give it a wash, because it's especially these days. There was an outbreak of avian influenza this year, so that's a really easy vector for birds to transmit it to each other.
So, listeners, please, if you have bird feeders, go wash them. So I guess this is more for our European listeners. I was wondering if you can give us any tips on how to test for the great tit culture in the garden. How do we start looking at these great tits differently, right?
Sure. You can make little puzzles for the tits to solve. There's a great documentary that the BBC made in the 80s that was like a big inspiration during my PhD. It's called The Bird Brains of Britain. So I highly recommend, if anyone is interested, go check it out, because they had everyday people just making little puzzles for their songbirds in their backyard. And they found that the great tits won the competition, but blue tits also can solve puzzles. And the pigeons, of course, are quite good at solving things. I think the worst they found were seagulls. But there's this really cool puzzle where they had a glass tube and they had matchsticks that were stuck through the tube. And basically the birds had to pull out the matchsticks one by one to get the peanut to fall down to the bottom. And so, I remember thinking like how cool that was. That's difficult to automate.
Right.
Yeah. The thing with the puzzle, so the puzzle boxes that we use were developed by Lucy Applin during her PhD. And it's very easy to automate something like that because all you have to do is move the door back into its original position.
Can you ever get to see great tits or any other kinds of birds collaborating in real time?
No, generally not. So the great tits are social in the wintertime, but only as social as they need to be. I would say they're still pretty competitive with each other. And so at the puzzle box, you get aggression behavior, you get guarding behavior. Getting them to cooperate, it would be interesting to show, but it's not something I think that happens very often in the wilds. Yeah.
So as soon as they know that, this puzzle box has food, has mealworms, they're like, okay, this is mine. I have to figure it out by myself.
Yeah, some birds for sure. I would say the more aggressive, dominant birds, definitely seen them trying to fend off other birds from using the puzzle box, which is frustrating as a researcher trying to get the behavior to spread in populations, because this is of course preventing spreading. But this is one of the really interesting behavioral things that keeps behaviors from spreading in populations.
So in a way, it's actually quite tricky for birds to try to learn from others, right? You have to figure out what is a good, safe distance for you to learn from another bird, because otherwise you get too close and then they get aggressive on you and you can't learn anything.
Tolerance is definitely a factor in learning, and it's in primates, of course, a lot of the social learning happens between mother and child, where tolerance is very high. I would say in great tits, it's approaching low, especially in the wintertime.
Yeah, that's interesting, like as a context, because throughout this whole entire podcast, I was thinking, okay, birds teach each other maybe, or they watch each other, and I didn't really think about the aggressive situation that they get themselves into.
Yeah, and I would avoid the teach word
exactly,
because they don't.
They don't teach. There's no language.
Yeah, there's no language and there's no intentional demonstration.
Right.
I would say. I mean, at least we don't have any evidence for it.
Oh, hold on, Michael just told us that he would not feel comfortable using the word teaching in animals. Is it because it's controversial?
Yeah, so the concept of teaching in the animal kingdom is actually a bit controversial because it's quite rare, and to define something as teaching, demonstrators actually need to adjust their behavior depending on the observer and how much they learn. During social learning, there doesn't necessarily need to have teaching going on, so social learning can be independent of this behavior. But one example researchers actually found in the animal kingdom is actually in meerkats, where the meerkat adults would try to teach their pups how to hunt for a scorpion. And they basically do this in multiple steps. When the pups are really young, they actually kill the scorpion and encourage the pups to eat it, even though if the pups are not interested. And as they grow older, what they do is basically move on to the next step and remove kind of the dangerous part of the scorpion and then give them a live scorpion to hunt. And finally, at the final step, they actually just give it a live scorpion for the pup to learn. So this kind of adjusting the behavior in a step-by-step way would, in that case, classified as teaching.
And so like for the pup, it will be better to have all these steps, because then when he's facing live scorpions, he knows how to kill it and without being stung.
Yeah, so kind of this would be classified as actual teaching behavior, because it's kind of this complex, really step-by-step way compared to normal kind of social learning that you might find in nature. It's usually just kind of one demonstrator doing something and the observer just observes.
Thanks for this clarification. Let's go back to Nak and Michael.
In light of all these research that we've been talking about today, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think the most important thing is for people to realize that birds actually have a pretty rich social life.
Mm-hmm.
And social information and social bonding is fairly important in a bird's life. And more generally, just how important social information is for species, for adapting to their environment. I think people imagine that they're, pre-programmed genetic machines and they know all they need to know from that. But actually, there's quite a lot of learning across the animal kingdom for really important behaviors like migration and foraging and all of these things. There's always, I think, probably some socially learned aspect to it, even if we can't easily see it. Yeah, so in terms of like conservation, for example, I think one thing that doesn't get a lot of attention is protecting the times or the places where this social information transfer happens. There should be maybe a lot of attention given to that.
So we've talked lots and lots about the great tits. How about you? Can you tell us a bit more about, your life as a researcher?
I've always tried to do some creative hobbies for my whole life, and I would say that designing and executing scientific experiments is the most challenging creative endeavor that I've ever tried to do. There's a lot to consider in terms of putting together the puzzle boxes, for example, putting together any data recording systems that you have, and also just the design of the experiment and getting the conditions and the right controls and everything that you need out in the end is, it's a great challenge, but it's enjoyable when it's all done and you have a nice data set.
Can you tell the listeners a bit more about what a typical fieldwork day looks like?
Yeah, there's a few different types of days that I would do. So the main thing is catching birds. So when you catch birds in the wild, you have some place where you've left a feeder for a few weeks, and this attracts the birds to that location, and they usually come around the same time every day. And we set up a big net, basically. It's actually a fishing net. It has a very thin mesh, and the birds can't see it that well, so they will fly into the net and fall into the pockets, and then we can take them out. And we put on a band, identification band, and also a RFID tag and all of these types of things. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous because you can just put up a net and 5 minutes later you have like 10 birds just sitting in the net. And sometimes it can be really boring. You get one bird every hour. It's definitely happened to me before. But sometimes it can be also really exciting when you get like a whole flock that fly in at the same time, and you have to be super quick about how you get the birds out.
So we've been talking all this time about animal research. What are the ethics or what are the precautions that are involved?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. Of course, all of the work that we do is covered under ethics permits. So in Germany, there's quite a process of you have to write an application, you need to provide justification. And generally, the work that I do, I don't do anything invasive to the birds, and I can feel good at the end of the experiment because I release all of the birds back into the wild. Sometimes I think even catching birds can be an ethical question because you're interrupting their day. They have a finite amount of time to find a lot of food, and you're basically taking a 30-minute chunk out of their day to put a ring on them and to measure how long their wing is. But this is the trade-off, is that you get scientific knowledge out of it, and people have been catching birds for over 100 years now using these methods. And yeah, with the right people doing it, with trained people doing it, I think it's safe for the birds. The other thing that I could say is that with the advancements in technology, it's making it actually more ethical than it was in the past. So if you just put a metal ring on a bird, you can't really do anything with that until you catch the bird again. But we use a small RFID tag that goes on the leg. And with this, these last for years, and we can monitor the population remotely. So we can create antennas, and all of our puzzle boxes have these antennas that record the ID of the individual without us actually having to even touch the bird or get close to the bird.
We're approaching the end of the podcast, so thank you so much for your time. One last question for you. If someone out there who's been listening to this entire podcast, they get motivated, they get really interested in the topics that you're involved in, and maybe they want to do what you do, do you have any tips for them?
One book that I can highly recommend is Eva Jablonka. The book is called Evolution in 4 Dimensions, and this was a big source of inspiration for when I was starting my PhD. And also, I mentioned before that BBC documentary. I highly recommend it. It's on YouTube. Bird Brains of Britain. Just search that. In terms of acquiring the skills that you need to do this type of work, I think that probably the longest time investment would be there's a lot of technology. Like, people think about wildlife studies and they're imagining this really classic Jane Goodall-esque kind of with a little notebook and following around, but actually the landscape has totally changed. And now if you have coding skills, if you can code in Python or in R, this is so useful to do wildlife studies. So I would definitely recommend. I taught myself it on the internet, so there's plenty of resources on the internet.
Where can people find you?
The easiest place to find me is probably on Twitter. My handle is Evogom, EVOGOM. You can find me there, and link to my website is there with all my papers.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's been so amazing and super interesting to hear more about your research.
Thanks for having me on the pod.
And this has been In the Swarm. Stay tuned for next time.